what I really hope would be an session. Um, we have with us Dr. Salma Malik, who, if you have been part of the strategic community of Pakistan in any capacity in the last, I wouldn't say how many number of years, but you would have heard about Dr. Salma Malik. And as she likes to say that she become part of the fixture of Qaid-e-Azam University, but every time she speaks, it's so eloquent, it's so fresh. So I give a formal introduction to Dr. Salma Malik. She'll be speaking on the impact of illicit proliferation on international security dynamics. And this topic is really important because I myself have been guilty of not putting enough effort on more of the small arms, light weapons, and the amount of damage that it does. We all have our bias. If you look into the number of deaths to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there were somewhere from 150,000 to 250,000 people. But the amount of people who die because of proliferation of small arms, weapons, every year there have 50,000 to 100,000 people who die every year. And I think there is bias around at least the state narratives that look into the larger issues and not much into the smaller statistical things, but which keep on piling up. So with us, we have Dr. Salma Malik. She's an assistant professor at the Department of Defense and Strategic Studies, Qaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad, and she specializes in the area of conflict and security studies in South Asia, South Asian affairs, and human security. She's an alumnus of Uppsala Institute in Sweden and the Asian Pacific Center for Studies, APCSSY. She's also a member working group on gender, peace, and security, national security division. Besides a member of IISS London, she is part of various other things such as the Regional Center for Strategic Studies, Lanka, on South Asian Tanks, Social Sciences Research Council, WISCOM, WDN, USA. So she's got a plethora of experience all over the world, not just in Pakistan. Prior to joining QAU, she worked as an research officer at the Institute of Strategic Studies, Islamabad, from June 1996 to August 1999. Her publications include the book Pakistan Security Problem and Challenges in the Next Decade, RCSS Policy Studies titled Small Arms and Security in South Asia, USIP study on mapping conflicts in Pakistan, besides articles in research journals, book chapters, and monthly columns. She's also given lectures as a guest speaker at the National Defense University, Islamabad, PF War College, Karachi, Naval War College, as well as Command Staff College, Quetta, as well as Fajna University. So with that, I would give the floor to Dr. Salma Malik. Usually we have, or the way the work has gone about it, the speaker has 45 minutes to speak, and then there's a Q&A session, but I would leave it up to the discretion of the speaker to decide for herself as far as how much time she wants to give and how much she wants to speak. Over to you, Dr. Salma Malik.
Thank you so much, Ali. It was such a generous introduction. I'm like, oh, wow, I've really done these things. Thank you, God bless. And please give me a ring because being I have this tendency of talking, so I don't want to put your participants to sleep or bore them to death. And as you people must realize, small arms proliferation and illicit trafficking, all of these stuff, that's one of my favorite subjects to talk on. So I picked this domain today when I was given this. Okay, so when we are looking at, as Ali has already introduced to you all, today I'm going to bring to you a topic which is a bit different from what we have discussed so far, illicit weapons trafficking, illicit weapons proliferation. Yesterday, we were looking at emerging technologies, and we were looking at how nuclear weapons are a game changer or may not be a game changer. But I think in the conflicts today, one of the main aspects that has the biggest impact are illicit weapons, or weapons, so to speak, not only illicit, but weapons per se. And when I joined this area of research, many of my colleagues would actually tell me as to why am I picking on small arms proliferation issues or problems related to illicit weapons trafficking, because nuclear weapons were the main thing to talk about, and they have a lot of marketability when it comes to research in our area. But I actually thought that nuclear weapons are made not to be used. Whereas when you're looking at weapons such as small arms, light weapons, firearms, these are weapons of everyday use. And unfortunately, when I say everyday use, that technically means that as we speak, there is someone in this city or beyond using a firearm which is licensed or unlicensed, which is licit or improvised, against someone to harm, whether it is a human or it is anyone else. But they're using these live guns to kill somebody, to harm someone, to fulfill their interest, and so many other things. So, nuclear weapons, one can only wish and pray that are never used in our lifetime. But illicit weapons are something that are used per microsecond, if I may exaggerate the term. Some of you who have monitored the press in the last 1 week or so must also be aware of one incident that recently took place in Japan, a country which has one of the highest number of, or one of the most vigilant and strict gun laws, where this young person in his 40s put together two pipes, an improvised trigger, and a barrel, and he managed to kill Japan's longest standing Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, when he was out campaigning for one of his colleagues. So it is as simple as that. All you need to do is come up with an improvised device. You don't need to have a weapon which is made in some very hi-fi armory or anything, but they can be as basic as this, or they can be as sophisticated as like them to be. And when we couple it up with emerging technology, then we have guns which are becoming highly sophisticated, and they are part of, they apparently look like part of fiction, but these are things that really hurt people. And this is human ingenuity, one would say, and also the fact that it is part of how humans tend to feel that gun empowers them, and the more it has the capacity to kill people, the better we feel. So this is some kind of a primitive instinct in humans. So it has a lot to do with psychology as well. Now, a counter argument when we are looking at guns and all is that gun by itself is just a cold metal. Unless someone picks it up, makes it ready to fire, puts a bullet in it, it will not fire on its own. At best, a person like me, what one can do with a gun is that hold it from the other end and strike someone very hard with by the barrel, and cause bodily injury. But other than that, unless one really makes that effort to put bullets and make it battle ready, the gun will not fire. So definitely it is the human behind the gun that matters. But yet the fact is, as Gray had said, weapons do not determine whether men will fight or how hard they will fight, but they will always dictate how they will fight, right? So it adds to the lethality of the overall flavor of war, battle, and everything. And when we're looking at licit or illicit, meaning legal weapons or illegal weapons, although the killing aspect remains the same, but the fact is that when you have an illicit weapon, you are the master of your own universe, where you can use that weapon without getting any trace, without any problem, as and where it does. With a licensed weapon, with a legal weapon, there is always this capacity, or there's always this aspect where it can be checked, it can be traced back to the owner, and a crime or any violent activity can very well be audited or monitored. But with illicit weapons, there is no aspect of traceability. And that is why I'm picking illicit weapons as a subject of discussion with you people today. So very quickly, just to make this distinction once again very clear, when we talk about small arms and light weapons, or when we talk about firearms, these are weapons that can be held by a single person or at best by two people, and they can be carried with a lot of ease from one place to another, and they don't remain restricted when we are looking at light weapons. So I'm using the overall terminology as weapons and not small arms or firearms or light weapons, but they also include man-held missiles. And if we expand the definition, although that is not a legal definition of firearms or light weapons, then in another universe, we may also include small bombs and bomblets that can do harm. However, for the point of legal consideration and clarification, bombs or landmines are not of small arms or firearms category. They are a totally different category, and different laws and rules about them. Also in terms of controlling and disarmament. And there are different protocols under which UN categorizes them and talks about them. So how do illicit weapons actually impact the internal security of a country? And why are we making this distinction? As I said before, when weapons are being made, there are 2-3 sources of for a country to acquire weapon or a country to have weapon. One source is to make weapons in its state armories. And when you make weapons in your state armory under international protocols and as a responsible country, every weapon that is made or anything that falls into this category has to have a numbering to it, a barcoding to it. As things are becoming sophisticated, so these aspects are also becoming sophisticated. And any weapon that is made, if it is made in the state armory, the principal client of the state armory, in case of Pakistan, it's the Pakistan Ordnance Factories in the city of Wah and some other places which are part of the larger enterprise. Those weapons, when they are sold to the principal client, and in this case, the principal client is the state of Pakistan or the Pakistani military, all three tiers of the Pakistani military, these weapons would be issued to the soldiers and the personnel and to the officers. And any weapon that is used along with the bullets or the ammunition that goes into that weapon can all be traced back to the owner or the person who's handling that weapon. So there's a very, very proper and a tedious protocol that goes into this. And if unfortunately military personnel uses his weapon, that entails a lot of penalty because that is tantamount to a big crime in ordinary terms. So this is how illicit weapons work. Other aspect for a country to acquire weapons is that you purchase weapons. Again, if you purchase weapons, there is this clause of end user certification as to whom that weapon is going to. Who is the principal client who is purchasing that weapon? So in case Pakistan purchases any weapons from Germany, for example, or country ABC, then country ABC and country XYZ are going to enter into an agreement where the weapon would only and only be used by that country. If there is a transfer technology protocol attached to that weapon, then we can make that weapon in our state armories and put it to our use. We are not, under that agreement, entitled to sell that weapon to a third country legally or illegally. If that weapon is traced back to us, then we are outlawed. So again, there is a very proper protocol when it comes to the sale and purchase of weapons. And the Stockholm Institute for Peace and Research, Stockholm International Peace and Research Institute, SIPRI, does carry out weapons transparency register in which, and that also became part of the UN protocol, in which all of these sales and purchase are mentioned. And this is kind of a voluntary audit that goes with that. A third aspect would be, if we are talking about legal weapons, that private sector or public sector enterprises make these weapons and sell to people for hunting purpose and all. But in this, you cannot have the prohibited bore weapons being sold, and those are several categories. I'm not getting into the details of that. And anyone who purchases those weapons has to have a license made for that gun and renewed it every year. And unfortunately, if there's a weapon theft, if there is any crime which can be traced back to that weapon, so the owner of that weapon is in trouble. So there's an entire protocol. In an ideal term, there's an entire protocol. In the first two categories, that protocol is very stringent. In the third category, where there's a sale of private weapons to private individuals, this realm enters into a lot of gray zone. But yet the fact is that that is also somewhat traceable. However, what is not traceable is weapons being made or exchanging hands out of this state jurisdiction, where I get hold of a weapon in any zone of conflict, and I cipher it off to someone else in another zone of conflict, and I end up empowering them, and they end up abusing that weapon. They end up using that weapon and indulging in genocidal activities, creating civil disobedience, civil disturbance in the country, and anything and everything that can happen under the sun in a conflict zone, where the rule of law is fragile to failed. And then again, if that weapon survives that particular conflict zone, then that weapon again changes hand and goes to another conflict zone to create a lot of problem. When in 1980s, the Soviet Union pulled out of Afghanistan after the signing of the Geneva Accords, there was an entire big market of weapons available in Afghanistan of all makes and kinds. That also included the American Stinger weapons, Stinger missiles, that became very famous, and there was a lot of myth that was created around it. And as we progress, we would also come to find out that most of the Afghan jihad, quote unquote, because I'm using this term to donate a particular time frame in Afghan war, did not have Western weapons in it. It had the Soviet weapons being used against the Soviet Union itself, and that was part of a grand design. Yet again, I come back to the initial point that weapons by themselves add to the lethality. They make a conflict zone far more problematic, but it's the human mind that uses them, abuses them, and channels them further. Okay, so how do illicit weapons end up damaging any country's internal security? There are several factors that impact that. One factor could be decades-long state policies in promoting violent culture, and also the fact that we kind of romanticize such cultures by saying that the is part of your official attire, you are what your gun is, your honor, gun is your honor, and so many other things. And we have subcultures in our country where gun is considered to be something very romantic, something very, which is part of the male ego and male attire, and that makes a man what a man is also is supposed to be. It's part of your initiation process. So there's a lot of cultural connotation to that as well, and that makes contributes to a violent culture in many respects, where a lot of decisions are made through that gun. And that makes the entire situation highly problematic. Another factor could be proximity of a country to, or geographical linkages of a particular country to conflict zones. And the third factor, then I'll then apply all of these to Pakistan, because I would like to look at it from the Pakistani angle. The third factor could be the role of external state actors or non-state actors in promoting illicit weapons for their vested interest. Then proliferation and easy availability of such weapons, which lead to violent framing of politics. Furthermore, you also have pockets of stability or instability inside your country, which become a catchment point or which attract illicit weapons to that particular space. Then, last but not least, is the inadequacy or lack of security in judicial reforms and improper implementation of law and order. So, if we put all of these things in perspective, unfortunately, our country is a classic case study when it comes to these things. And I must also mention here that Pakistan is one of those countries which has the highest per capita weapon holding of weapons per person ratio, which makes it extremely problematic. So Pakistan has also been neighbors to zones of conflict. There's a proximity of Pakistan and geographical linkages of our country, both to Afghanistan, and Afghanistan for the longest has been highly problematic, as well as to Kashmir. There is also decades-long state policies which willingly, unwillingly, intentionally or unintentionally have promoted violent cultures. And also sub-state policies that I just mentioned about, that we are proud to wear the gun. The gun is part of the gun is our mother. Is also a notion, and we usually laugh about these things, but that is part of the prestige and the ego or being what a man is all about. Then we also have external neighboring actors, India, so to speak, that has promoted illicit weapons into the system to create domestic instability. And the more the illicit weapons, the more the scale of violence, the intensity of violence, and more would be improper implementation of law and order. And then, of course, when you have a culture of gun violence, then politicians and various other factions, vested interest groups, make it a point to proliferate them and make these weapons easily available so that they can create small pockets of instability and become stakeholders in instability, domestic instability, and several other things in the country, and challenge the internal and external security dynamics and modify them to their heart's content. Because they tend to gain a lot more when there is domestic insecurity and instability and violence. And we have seen this happening in terms of how India introduced the guns in the Pakistani context in Karachi, and then few of the regional and then later later national level political parties capitalized on that gun violence, and Karachi became the ground zero for extreme gun violence and problems that were happening as a result of that. So those aspects are there. So have the small arms or illicit weapons really contributed to the fragility or the failure of the state? Definitely. Can we actually draw a distinction between fragility and failure? Yes. Fragility, I would say, is several steps less than failure. When we are talking about fragility, that means that there's still a lot of space in that society to reclaim the law and order and to once again become a country which is internally, and there is a lot of space for reforms, implementations of rule of law, and several other things. Unfortunately, when we're talking about failure, then failure is something where there is no central control at all, and most of the decision making is actually being done through empowerment of different stakeholders, and how those different stakeholders, in case of a state failure, become empowered is visible from the photos that we see, that if the Taliban administration is sitting in the Afghan presidential palace, then the table is littered with AK-47s and various other lethal weapons, which is actually a show of how strong they are and how powerful they are. So that is actually a statement without saying it that they mean business. And the language of negotiation is not going to be a soft talking, women talking to each other or people negotiating on a diplomatic front, but technically what they're going to talk about is through the power of gun. So that makes the entire difference between a fragile state which can reclaim its lost spaces, which still has its institutions intact, which still has the space through which it can redress the failing aspects of the country. But then you come to a point where the entire system has come to a grounding halt and totally slipped down. And the power of the gun is actually making the decisions move the way they are. But unfortunately, in case of Pakistan, what we see is that successive administrations for the vested interest have tolerated emergence of illicit markets, arms markets, as well as the capacity and the demand for illicit arms. And that has been a factor that has contributed very strongly to weapons proliferation as well as to state fragility in a very direct direction. But plus, we also have markets within the country, which again have been part of the popular folklore where weapons have been made, and we have very proudly claimed that James Bond and so many other people have done purchased weapons from Pakistan and done these things and all that stuff. So Pakistan, as a case study, is a very diverse and complex security profile. It has areas of extreme violence and insecurity, and it also has what Anatole Levin in his very popular book on Pakistan talked about as island successful modernity and effective administration. So it's kind of a controlled chaos where people who are empowered would feel that it is actually they have in their capacity to control the chaos, they have in their capacity to unleash violence and then claim it back. But this is a false myth. This is totally a false perception. Once violence is unleashed, once you empower individuals uh, with guns, and once you teach them the language of violence, it is very difficult to unlearn it. And this is the biggest problem when it comes to illicit weapons. And unfortunately, Pakistan has had its orientation into that through this aspect. And the biggest issue that we had with gun violence, introduction of illicit weapons, all was the Afghan jihad of that time, where the domestic market, which Pakistan inherited as of century back in the Dara Adam Khel and other places, was once again rekindled, and weapons were made, and there was a lot of urban folklore attached to that. The people sitting in the Dara are very valiant people. They are making guns out of nothing, and small huts are making world-class weaponry, and so on and so forth. None of this was incorrect. All of this was absolutely correct. But unfortunately, what it did to the Pakistani domestic politics was it not only brought guns to every household in a very, very strong fashion, it also sort of nullified and challenged the state's capacity to govern. And if we look forward to another point, which I would call a weak social contract, that happens as a result of too many guns in the system, then it also brought about violent actors who have used political or religious ideology to justify their violence and their militancy and empowered them. The group of people who have benefited from the weak social contract emanating because of trafficking of weapons are the vigilante groups who who have actually now graduated or had graduated to informal justice system. Many people in Sawat and the erstwhile Fata would actually go to the local militant of that area to seek justice after the formal justice system had failed for generations. And the justice would come very swiftly. Both the parties would be called, and the guilty party would face the gun and the justice served. So people kind of like that idea that this was a very swift justice. But what it has also killed along with the human being is the formal justice mechanism and the state's capacity to govern and to be the main authority. So that has totally neutralized and killed the state's role in this system, which is already quite weak, so to speak. Then it was also empowered the call for religious or the Sharia, that you're using weapons and you're making people agree to what your version of religion is all about. I'm not, let me qualify here for all is that I'm not saying that Sharia is wrong, but a warped interpretation of Sharia, which only talks about punishment, not appeasement or not justice, but punishment only and punitive actions, and those punitive actions are happening through the power of gun, is something that one cannot really envision or talk about. Then, of course, it has empowered interest groups. And it has also, from the Afghan Jihad to 9/11, changed the meta narrative in the country. So these aspects have been um, quite dangerous to make Pakistan what it is today. So we have talked about the state fragility versus the state failure aspect. And if you have to actually, in terms of looking at how the internal security dynamics work or not work, there are various mechanisms through which we can measure the state performance. We have the human, none of those measures, I must qualify here, are indigenously made or tailored, but we can tailor them to our specification. But those measures include the Human Governance Index, Human Security Index, and several other indices, so to speak. But there's also overall domestic security indices as well, which look at how the state is performing. So bring this idea in mind that you have a small location or a locality where the local militant leaders, through the power of gun, not only kill the state agents in that area, but they also disallow the women folk of that area to seek education. They disallow the normal functioning of that small micro society. And not only are they spreading fear, they're also killing the governance as well as stability mechanisms of that small area. And that is going to spread in a longer fashion. So at various levels, you can then perform the state you can then measure the state performance and find out how the state is doing or not doing. So that aspect is there. Although we can also see that illicit weapons have a very, very strong and deep impact when it comes to a conflict zone, which is very visible. But we also must notice that in a non-conflict environment, illicit weapons have just that much of impact that they would have in a conflict zone. Although it is very, very, very glaringly obvious when it is the conflict zone, how the weapons are being used, how people are being killed, but we tend to underestimate how powerful illicit weapons can be in a conflict environment. In domestic violence, women are being killed. In locally based jirgas or informal justice system, illicit weapons are very easily used. Improvised weapons are used and done away with, and they are never recorded or audited in whatever sense. As I said, Pakistan has several state as well as regulated as well as unregulated spaces through which weapons are brought into the country or they are made. State armories, public sector armament industry, private manufacturers. But then also we have had illicit routes or unregulated sectors, which at best we can call the gray zone. In this gray zone, we would have the Dara weapons. And in this gray zone, we would also have the weapons which are trading hand from different conflict zones and moving in this underworld, so to speak. But interestingly, when I was researching on the gun laws, I came across this old poster from the First World War, which was an Indian recruitment poster coming, it's part of the Imperial War College thing, and you can always search it on the net, where you have a soldier wearing the uniform, and he has a gun in his hand. There's no face to the soldier. There's a question mark written instead of the face, and it says, ये रुपया बंदूक और वर्दी कौन लेगा, वही जो फौज में फौरन भर्ती होगा. For those who are not Urdu speakers, I would repeat this in English. Who will take this uniform, the gun, and the money? And the answer is, and there's a hand which is holding a lot of money in their hand, but then there's also a soldier who's carrying weapons. And the answer is the person who immediately takes recruitment in the military. So that was one way of kind of romanticizing the gun and inducing people to use the weapons or to join the military, because people thought that joining the military would also, and that was part of the British practice, that would regularize illicit weapons as well. The unregulated space or the illicit weapons, as I said, the Darra armament industry has been a very, very strong presence in the country. But then there have been efforts that shall we regulate the Darra market. But the money that the Darra manufacturers would make at one time, not anymore, I would say, but depending on how the Western border warms up, so does the Darra market. But then there's a lot of weapon coming from the entire world into our neighborhood. So that also makes the Darra market a little less feasible. But in the 1980s, which was the golden phase for the Darra armament industry, there were weapons being made on demand by the state parties and being pilfered to Afghanistan, and that weapon would go from Pakistan to Afghanistan and then get recycled into Pakistan, or the weapons that were coming for the Afghan jihad through the various supply lines were being routed via Rawalpindi or Karachi through Quetta, Peshawar into Afghanistan, but the weapon pipeline really leaked everywhere. And in all the spots that it would come, whether it was coming by a boat, it was coming by via air, there were agents who would be holding back the stashes. And that contributed to a lot of weapon overflow in Pakistan and as well as in Afghanistan. And there are layers of weapons that we find here. So not only are there weapons in this zone, if I may use this term, from the illicit market of Darra and various smaller sister markets around it, there are also weapons which have been supplied to Afghanistan during the 1980s. Then there are weapons which have been part of the supply chain post-Soviet withdrawal. Then once again, when the Afghan conflict was re-internationalized, the Western powers, the US along with the ISAF, they actually put sanctions on the Taliban that they should not carry the weapons, but they asked the Pakistani authorities to help the northern alliance at that time to acquire as much weapons as possible. So this selective sanctioning on various agents when it comes to conflict becomes a very problematic area. Last but not least, we again have once again an inflow or demand flow of weapons post Ghani government's departure, and with the Taliban coming in and many of the non-state actors still performing in Afghanistan. So again, the demand for weapons into Afghanistan has started, and we've also seen that there is a resurfacing of militancy in Pakistan, which is happening through the power of gun. So all of these things. One very interesting aspect of the Afghan jihad was not only romanticizing the jihad by saying that these are glorified freedom fighters and they are mujahideen, so which actually appealed both sides of the divide. It appealed to the leftist or the seculars or those who were of a Western mind that the communists were being defeated. And those who did not believe in the capitalist and communist ideology, then the religious clothing of this US Soviet proxy war was done through making Afghanistan ground for jihad and all the Afghan fighters mujahideen. And ultimately, when the US brought in the Stinger missiles to bring down the Soviet Hind helicopters, so that also became part of an urban myth where they would show these Afghan warriors holding a what do you call this missile launcher on their shoulder and standing at the back of Toyota trucks and firing while the truck is moving in the air, firing in the air and down a helicopter. So things have really been romanticized and they became what they are today. Right. Ali, how much time do I have? Please let me know. I will
You
keep
still have
speaking.
5 more,
I
but
have 5 more minutes. I'll just take an extra 5 minutes and then I'll close shop. And then we can open discussion. And the other part of this Afghan jihad was where weapons, not only weapons were being romanticized, um, the bigger damage done was how the curriculum for the Afghan refugee students was modified and how the guns were made part and parcel of their psychological makeup. So I have these images of the basic primers that were being taught in the refugee camps of that time in Pakistan and several other places. And interestingly, the counting was done where one had a Kalashnikov, two had two grenades, three meant again three guns. In place of four, there are four bullets, and it goes on that way, right? And this actually kind of for a young child who is getting oriented into this world system, he or she is not looking at a teddy bear, he or she is not looking at flowers or birds or cats and dogs, but from day one they are actually being taught that it is only the gun which matters. And then again, in the Islamic books, the curriculum would have highlights of jihad and benefits of war fighting, the right jihad, the just war, etc., were highlighted to the maximum. And that unfortunately created a lot of problem. Um, two more things, and then I will start wrapping up. In Pakistan, because of the illicit weapons, and even when licit weapons become illicit, is a phenomenon that if we blame a particular regime in the 1980s for introducing or for having very loose gun laws and romanticizing the gun, then in the successive years, the political parties that came into power also did not really carry out anything or any sufficient measures to curb this menace. Although there were anti terrorist laws, there were several other things, but gun by itself was not really focused upon. In fact, it was gun licenses and permits were used as a means to incite and a means to incentivize their political stakeholders. So if I were heading a political party and I was the interior minister of that country, and I had a quota of, say, 100 license, so I would multiply that quota by 1,000 and make sure my ministry ends up stamping licenses for a lot more people than my required quota. One. And number two, against one license, several guns were registered. So this was political appeasement. Under the next military regime, post 9/11, there were efforts that the government undertook to curb gun laws. They made strict gun laws. There was a countrywide de-weaponization effort, which was actually on the papers a wonderful de-weaponization campaign. But as unfortunately the case in Pakistan, that it was not really worked out thoroughly, and there was not a very effective implementation and a follow-up process. And when I went around interviewing people, they said, why should we give up our weapon when those who are threatening us or those against whom we have acquired these weapons are still armed? And interestingly, when the Afghan refugee camps were audited for de-weaponization, these young kids, they would bring 303 weapons and get $100 per piece and go back and bring another one the next day. And the UNIDR, which was doing this de-weaponization campaign, they asked one boy as to where is he getting the guns, and most of those guns were totally dysfunctional. So he said, the real guns are at home. I'm technically just bringing the old weapons that were lying in the basement. So it was a very vast kind of a de-weaponization and disarmament effort, and all these things can only work if there is a comprehensive plan with incentivizations which were there, and there were also punishments which were outlawed, but those punishments were really not meted out. And despite people being challaned and all, there was no follow-up, so people did not really think that there is a need to follow up on this. What has illicit weapon done to Pakistan? It has not only weakened the state control, it has the social contract. It has also contributed a lot to terrorism, militancy in the country, made them very much empowered. It has, at the same hand, as I said earlier, weakened the state authority. Many a times, if you talk about the law enforcement agencies, and we ask them these questions as to why your response towards militants or terrorists has been so lax, then they say, have you checked their weapons and have you seen ours? There are poles apart. We have 100 years difference between the quality of the weapons. And then later on, of course, these things were redressed. But the fact is that non-state actors, those who are not part of the illicit protocols, they have the luxury of acquiring any and all type of weapons and do immense damage to the state, and get away with that because there is no way to regulate them or to make them better. Pakistan has had several security sector reforms. To qualify at the end, do not think that we do not have gun laws. We have gun laws. We initially we had inherited the gun laws that were there from the British side, but in 1965 we had the Pakistan Arms Ordinance. Then after the de-weaponization, after the assemblies and all, they decided to have provincial listing. So every province has its own arms ordinance and weapons bill that has come up. There is also a Surrender for Illicit Arms Act, which is of 1991. And there are a lot of things. But I would also say, while concluding, that there is too much of legislation. There is over legislation. What we actually require is a comprehensive political will when it comes to getting rid of illicit weapons. We also require to see that our borders are secure, and a very difficult pill to swallow is that we do not become participatory to any of the cross-border activities that are happening, which would, in retaliation, invite militant actors inside the country. But the best thing that we need to do to curb all of these aspects is, besides border management, besides proper licensing, regulations, upping the institutional performance, regional measures and the international measures that there's a program of action on small arms and several other things. What we also need to do is better governance. And the only way to control this problem and having a better secure internal dynamics is through stellar governance performance, and that will only and only be the main factor that can help us control these weapons of everyday usage. Thank you so much, Ali. I'm done.
Thank you so much, Dr. Salma, for such an eloquent but comprehensive take on the topic. And I'm sure this would lead to a lot of brainstorming and curiosity and questions by the participants. Certainly, I had a lot of questions, but I think I'll wait till the end for them. So, guys, if you have a question, please raise your hand and then I will come to you. You may first introduce yourself, tell us where do you come from, and your designation, and then you may ask the question. So first, there is Sikandar Azam Khan. Would you please unmute your mic and ask the question to Dr. Salma? Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, Madam Salma. Welcome back. Yesterday, we had quite a lecture from you as well. So, ma'am, my question is, since the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan, the gun culture has been very rampant in the area of Balochistan, specifically because it borders with Afghanistan. And Kalashnikov is considered as one of the deadliest weapon in the history that have killed thousands of lives. My question is, in Pakistan culture, the gun culture or the illicit weapon has remained the source of prejudice and pride. People usually, when they have marriages and parties, they have aerial firing and to show off and to take pride in that. As you mentioned, there are certain policies regarding that, but they are not into practice. So how to curb that thing? Because neither of the party is going to get this opportunity away from them, as you mentioned, the political leaders and the party and those, you can say, the landlords, they don't want to get away from that opportunity, because if any person is open for them, what they're going to do, their politics or their agenda that they're pursuing is good. That's my question. Thank you. Would want your opinion.
Thank you, Sikandar.
Thank you so much, Sikandar.
Ali,
Salma, would you
can
like
we
to
have
make...
two more questions and then I'll respond? Right.
Sure. Then we have Imran Abbas, who has raised their hand. Imran, please introduce yourself and you may ask the question to Dr. Salman.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Salma, for a very comprehensive presentation here. So my question is that all those countries having a reasonable established military industrial complex, are they really interested in stopping this illicit weapon trafficking? Because at the end of the day, they are also the beneficiary of this, technological proliferation, profiting from the black market, and then having the access to all these technologies and improvisations that are taking place. So and you can see even that black market is actually the one of the basic main component of the overall money, and we see that then they start coming very regular lobbying groups within the politics of the country, the example of United States even. So whether these states are interested, states can be interested if they are victim of this illicit trafficking. That's even Pakistan. Pakistan has been one of the worst victims of this small weapons and the terrorism, and it all happened. So that's one question, and if I'm allowed to have a second question.
Sure, go ahead. Imran, please go ahead.
Please.
Okay, so what happens is that what causes this all illicit trafficking to end up in any hotspot is the way often the wars are ended and the way the wars are being fought. We have twice the example of Afghanistan. The war ended in a hustle-bustle fashion, leaving Afghanistan into a turmoil of all the weaponry that was left behind. And then we can see what has happened throughout the Middle East. And so the problem is that the wars are not ending in a fashion that they should be ended in a more proper and a formal way. And secondly, the asymmetry that exists between a major power taking an offensive action against a minor power, and then the minor power resorting to the guerrilla warfare, a subconventional warfare, and that ends up, even those innocent, like, not the part of consortium of terror, they also become one having these illicit small weapons. So it had the two ways, like, the entry of power promoting this kind of a response from a smaller nation, and then the ending of the war in a very not regular fashion. Thank you.
Right.
Before Ma'am Salma, I give you the floor. Just an announcement. Once you've asked a question, please, you may lower your hand. And secondly, try to keep your questions short and to the point so that maximum number of people can participate in it. Thank you.
I think I'll just take up these two questions and then revert to Bakas.
I'll just take up these two questions.
Okay. I'm echoing.
I think the mic has been unmuted now. It's good, ma'am. You can go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'll just take these two questions because Imran has asked multiple questions, not one. And there was a question by Bakas as well, which I'll come later to. Okay, Sikandar, Soviet invasion, weapons coming to Balochistan, the AK-47 aerial firing, absolutely. Actually, the thing is, tried to keep myself very restricted. I could talk for the next at least 2 to 3 hours non-stop, but that would actually mean that I would be boring you people to death. All of these things are absolutely pertinent that you have mentioned. The Kalashnikov culture that we talked about, that had become part and parcel of Pakistan. And I'm happy to note that it has somewhat minimized a little bit by percentage, but not enormously. But a lot of what you have talked about is because of the VIP culture that Pakistan has. And the point that I was making here, that political civil military elites, and I'm actually using the term civil military elites, at various intervals to appease their constituencies or to appease different political actors for their own purpose, have overlooked the same gun laws that they put into place themselves. Plus, the fact that I talked about was the lack of implementation or the poor implementation that has been there. So if you make a stellar gun law and it only remains part of a book chapter, then it's as good or bad as the quality of paper on which it has been printed, unless and until you actually implement it and you mean it. And the implementation starts from home. So if I am a Malik in my area, and I am the one who institutes a gun law, and at the very same time in the evening, I go and do aerial firing at my own children's wedding, that totally kills the law by itself, because I, the architect of that policy, am not implementing it. And that unfortunately has been the case in Pakistan. Now, I could have shown certain slides which are part of which can actually tell us as to how the weapons were moving inside Pakistan and then going to Afghanistan and re-entering Pakistan. So the usual port of entries or the areas of entries would be Karachi through ship, or it would be to Rawalpindi, and that was during the Afghan Jihad time, or through air into via air, it would come to Peshawar, to Rawalpindi, or to Karachi. But then Pakistan restricted these areas to 2 points only, and then Karachi. And at the peak of one of the ethnic parties in Karachi, the port and shipping ministry was in the hand of that particular political party only, so that no one could audit the type of cargo that was entering through the shipping areas. Right? So this is how you legalize illicit flow of such dangerous cargo. I'm the boss, I'm the auditor, I'm the receiver, I'm the user. So that's as simple as that. At the peak of conflict in Karachi, the main Karachi was in the hand of one political party, one ethnic group, and the fringes of Karachi the encirclement of Karachi, where the transportation as well as trade and commerce was entering the city to go to the port, was in the hand of another ethnic group. And both of them were armed. And in between were other smaller actors who had their weapon stashes. So that made it a very, very dangerous situation. So when the weapons would go into Afghanistan, that would be mainly from the land route of Peshawar and beyond, and through Quetta. And then again, and that is where the main Afghan political party leaders were stationed. And then again, because the Pak-Afghan border uh, has become or had become very, very porous. And one of the reasons as to why the Pakistani authorities have fenced the border and the Afghans have major issues with that is to check the illicit flow of human as well as other type of lethal cargo into the country. And various areas, Kuchlag and so many other areas, are still an open field through which any type of lethal cargo can exchange hands and enter into the country. So yes, that has been to and fro movement. About the MICs, especially the bigger countries' MICs, yes, they are very much involved in proliferating weapons. Americans are famous for introducing, so are the Russians. When Soviet Union broke down, one of the major merchandise that Soviets or the Russians started to sell to the African countries who were involved in domestic inter or intra feuds was this lethal cargo. Some of you may not remember, but there was one incident in which a Soviet Antonov, when it took off from the Karachi airport after a fuel restop, an unscheduled fuel stop, it fell very close to the airport, and it was carrying weapons for other places. So this thing has also happened, but for countries which have legitimate weapon industry, their interest actually is more into selling weapons legitimately, right? So that weapon can actually bring a lot of revenue and can create a lot of market. And the fact that the Arms Trade Treaty, this is a treaty which was internationally formulated, was signed was to discourage countries such as Pakistan and smaller countries which are trying to create a weapon market for themselves, illicit weapons market, not illicit weapons market, was to sort of discourage them and weaken them. And Pakistan has not signed on to this because Pakistan has its very strong reservations and also protectionism of its domestic industry. But the fact is that Pakistan's domestic industry is not doing all that great. The principal client remains the Pakistani military, and beyond that, few smaller countries which cannot afford very sophisticated American weaponry. And Pakistani government or public sector weapons market was also producing some weapons under license, such as German Heckler Koch was being made there and being sold to Middle Eastern countries because there was a protocol under which the Germans could not sell that weapon directly to the Middle Eastern countries. But Pakistan had that end user privilege, so it could do that. So this has also happened, but yes, I totally agree, but that is more in the realm of licit to illicit weapons. And when it comes to illicit weapons trafficking, then that is a totally black market of the US collaborating with the black market anywhere in the world. And this globalization of black market and illicit cargo is far more stronger than globalization of any other actors. War termination mechanisms that you talked about, your second question, yes, I think that is extremely important. That is important in a sense that how are you terminating a conflict? Even if you put a disarmament clause on a war termination agreement, that does not mean that the parties would honor that particular agreement. And that is the biggest dilemma that happens. Unless and until there are sufficient conditions which incentivize disarmament and demobilization. If you do not have enabling environment that disincentivizes the belligerents to give up their weapons, there is enough generation of economic activity. So there is no incentive or there is no privilege available to the commoners in a post-conflict society that they would give up weapons. So you can have the best of the DDRs, you can have the best of war termination agreements. Geneva Accords also had that, Doha had that, so many other war termination accords have a disarmament clause. And now after 9/11, this has become a routine practice, and DDR came back with a very bang. DDR, for those of you who are not familiar with conventional weapons, think that is disarmament, demobilization, and reconstruction. So DDR has really been put in place. So has it been in place in Afghanistan and Pakistan. But because there is no enabling peace environment or stable environment, the common people do not feel the incentive to give up weapons. Right. And I agree, these are weapons of the weak. Yes, so long as conflict is there, these weapons will have a market.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Salma. Sayyid Waqas Ali Bukhari first, and then Adila Ahmed, please.
Waqas had one question about dirty bombs, and
do you have another question, Waqas, or was that it?
Waqas is asking, unmute me, please.
Faraz, if you can please do that.
You have the option to unmute yourself. That's not restricted. Try now.
Because if it's a problem, then I'll give the floor to Adila first, and you may type your question. I'll take that just after Adila is done.
I have two of Waqas questions. So Adila, you can ask, and then we'll come back to that.
Adila, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Ma'am, first of all, you gave a very good picture of the subject. So, ma'am, as you talked about the challenges and then with good recommendation. So, ma'am, my question is particularly from you that when you talk about governance is needed to counter the challenges. So, my question is how much optimistic you are with regard to our present situation, and how much time it needed to counter such challenges in a good way. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Right. Thank you, Adila. Okay, I think I have three questions, Adila's, Waqas, and Sarah's. Time, right. Okay, let me respond to this question first. How much time is taken? I think, Adila, there is no absolute time frame. The sooner the better. The more vigilant and the more we are pushed about doing it, the better it would be, right? There is certainly an awareness, because unfortunately Pakistan has gone through this has been baptized by fire kind of an approach, where we have seen the worst end of how this overwash of weapons has an effect on a society, right? Post 9/11, where the entire world was calling us the bad people, we were the ones who were suffering at the hands of militants, terrorists, whatever name that you would like to give them. And interestingly, let me also add one point here. There can be a militant who was just a militant, who is creating, who is a miscreant, who is creating problems just for that, just like that. And he may also be a soldier for hire one day. The next day, he would be a religious ideologue or a political ideologue. The third day, that person would become a terrorist. So there is no absolute situation where you'd say that A is going to do what A has always done, and it's not going to do what B is or what C is. they are all interchangeable. Their language is that of, because you have empowered them with gun, they'll use that gun whosoever offers them the money and the right environment. And that's about it. Yes, some of them are truly wedded to their concepts and their ideas, and there's no budging, but that doesn't really change that, oh, there is one person who's a militant and he has an AK-47, he's going to be more charitable in killing us than a person who's a religious ideologue or a political ideologue. And when he kills us, they may just use some religious chant, but killing is killing. So that factor is there. For the Pakistani state authorities, especially the security sector, because they were the ones who faced the worst of this brunt, and not only the military, but also the law enforcement agencies. We have never overplayed the role or the impact the Pakistani police had as a result of post 9/11 security situation, but we have lost some stellar police officers in this game, some young, wonderful personnel belonging to police. So everyone has suffered. So the realization amongst them is extreme, and they really want to do it. And there have been agendas, there have been intervals in which reforms have been introduced. There were police reforms introduced, but there's always some internal inertia that prevents these reforms from taking place in full capacity. But the sooner we get rid of our VIP culture, the sooner we get rid of this notion that these weapons of ultimate chaos are in our control and all we need to do is turn on the tap or turn off the tap, the better it would be for us, because this is all a fiction of imagination. Once you unleash instruments of violence in a society, once you introduce tools of killing in a society, then that society is destroyed, its DNA is distorted. So it takes time to reclaim that DNA, to put it in the right correction course through the type of medicine that you require. But we really have to, I mean, after the APS incident, I mean, one turning point for Pakistan in this entire debate on what the right moment is, I would actually say the defining moment was the APS school, in the Army Public School incident. The National Action Program that came out after result of that, for 1 year, there was a lot of momentum, everyone was unanimous. But many a times what we have seen is that when any anti-terrorist or counter-terrorist effort is being underfoot by the state, either political actors are not on board or the military thinks that it is not the right moment. But APS was one time when both were on board. The civil and the military were unanimous in their dealing. And if we had done what we required in that, and these windows of opportunity are not too big. So one has to capitalize on those windows of opportunity. Had we done it at that time, I think a lot of stuff would have been better. Sarah Nazir's question was on ATT for stopping trafficking of illicit weapons. Sarah, I must say one thing here. Although there are a lot of merits to these treaties, but as a point was being stated earlier, Dr. Imran had raised this point as well about the bigger markets or the bigger industries trying to curb the younger or smaller industries from producing weapons. Such treaties actually become an instrument of selective disarmament or arms control. This is similar to how the nuclear weapons or the NPT has also worked. So many a times, Pakistan has put its reservations forward that these are the problems that we have. We have live zones of conflict around us. So these things cannot happen. We cannot undertake several measures that are put there. Also, when it came to the landmine, mine ban treaty, Pakistan again said that as a country which is a poor country, landmines or such weapons are of use for us and we are going to use them. However, having said all of this stuff, the illicit weapons, can the ATT stop trafficking of illicit weapons? No, it can never stop the trafficking of illicit weapons, because illicit weapons are not in the control of any country. If you think that there is a strong presence of illicit weapons in country A, and the country A is penalized as a result of those illicit weapons, they'll move to country B. They'll move hands, they'll move location. And in case of Afghanistan, look at this scenario post Taliban 1 and Taliban 2. Both are not recognized by the international community. So in the space called Afghanistan, they can do whatever they feel like doing because they are not bound by any international jurisdiction or protocols. And they can use whatever excuse they have. There was a time, I will just use one example here to explain how this works, that when the Mullah Umar's regime of Taliban came into power, the first thing they said was, because they appealed Sharia a lot, so they said that we are not going to produce drugs on Afghan soil and we are going to destroy all the drug fields, etc. But once they were sanctioned by the international community, Mullah Omar gave this statement that he said that we are not going to use drugs in Afghanistan because that is illegal, and that's an opiate, and we are not going to use anything which is addictive or opiate, etc. However, it is a produce, it is an agricultural crop. So we are going to box it and send it to countries where drug trafficking is happening, and we're going to earn revenue. You people have sanctioned us. There's the only way we can earn money. So one has to be careful about that. Non-state actors using illicit weapons, trafficking, Waqas question. Yes, it's usually the non-state actors. Most of the time, it's the non-state actors that use illicit weapons. But in many countries, you would have state agencies which are controlling the flow and proliferation of illicit weapons as well. So don't think that only state actors are not under any governmental control, who are free agents, are doing all this. There are state agents who are also indulging in similar practices. And about the dirty bombs, these are home improvised weaponries.
Vikas had another question. Is there any international protocol which restricted the disposal of nuclear waste to avoid its trade in illicit arms market? Ma'am, can I take this?
Please do. Please do.
Vikas, so three things. One, there is the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material that almost all state parties are party to it, especially their second review. Then there is also UNSCR 1540, which restricts or puts a responsibility on all state parties to ensure that any nuclear material does not go into the hands of any other actor. And plus, thirdly, it's a scientific issue as well, that most of the nuclear waste is highly radioactive. Thus, handling it and using it in an improvised explosive device would be really, really difficult. And then again, the trade-off wouldn't be as spectacular, because all these radioactive materials do is that they are area denial weapons. They can deny you the use of certain areas, but they do not have a strategic deterrent effect on any actor whatsoever. So you may look into that. First, Haitham Abbas, then Maheen Manzoor, and then we'll come to Samran, your question. Haitham, would you go ahead, please?
Hello, assalamu alaikum. Am I audible, sir?
Yes,
Yes, you are.
First of all, thank you, ma'am, very much for this wonderful talk. My name is Mohammad Haitham Abbas, and I'm a student of strategic studies, currently doing my bachelor's in it from the National Defense University in Pakistan. Ma'am, my question was about these sort of 3D printed weapons and these new waves of it, because I think that the 3D printed industry has come a long way from these sort of single shot weapons, with people making entire semi-auto assault rifles, and even designs of AR-15s are present on the internet. So how do you regulate these sort of weapons, which can be assembled at your home and are way different and way more effective than these sort of conventional pipe guns, which was used in the assassination of President Shinzo Abe? Could you shed some light upon that, madam? Thank you.
Sure. Very good question,
Maheen.
Assalamu alaikum, sir. Assalamu alaikum, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you, ma'am, for giving us this wonderful presentation. I'm a student of National Defense University, currently doing bachelor's in strategic studies. So my question is a very short one. Ma'am, as you have told us, the several factors behind the gun culture in several countries. So what is your comment on the reason behind gun culture in United States? As we have seen the recent situation in Indiana and several cases in the past. So I want to know what is your take on this? Thank you.
Thank you, Maheen. Okay, going in reverse, starting with Maheen's question. Americans are quite a country. They have, as part of their constitution, which was an old constitution, and when it was made after the Civil War and all, it had the use of, legitimized the use of weapon or carrying the weapon as part of a state duty. And I'm being a bit vague here, so kindly just read the initial few clauses of American Constitution. Why? Because it was considered to be a national duty to carry the weapons. Let me also see if I can come up with those clauses. So to protect and to protect the national interest of your country, right? And that has been misinterpreted or used very generously in the successive generations, where it has kind of been said that the Constitution allows us to carry the weapon, and the Constitution allows us to carry the gun for our self-protection. However, having said that, there are a lot of states in the US which have different type of take on the gun laws. Some are more strict, some are not. But with America, this story about freedom of expression and freedom of life and all of these things are used by people very strongly. Plus, the gun lobby is very, very strong there. They contribute a lot of money to the parliament or to the legislative process. Second aspect. The third aspect is that when it comes to having a universal voting on banning or constraining the use of weapons in the US, again, the gun lobby and people who favor carrying the gun, they vote against having a blanket resolution. And the US is those countries which is worst affected by the gun culture. In fact, this current incident about Shinzo Abe, way back in the 1980s, one of the American presidents, Ronald Reagan, was also fired upon by a person called John Hinckley when he was leaving a convention, and he said that I was fan of such and such a Hollywood actor who had told me to do this, right? So all that crap that comes with it. So you have people who are doing whatever they're doing. They're loan sharks, they are one-man terrorist groups, etc. They're cults. But that is what America is all about. And this romancing with the gun and their relying on the gun is actually destroying the society, and they really need to do something about it. But there are several factors, starting from the Constitution to the base level where the lobbies are not really interested in doing what they are. Waqas, about your question on the dirty bomb, those are conventional weaponry which also have a radioactive element to them, and their disposal and several other things which make them very dangerous. So there are protocols that go with that. Haysam, your question about the new weapons and the 3D stuff, that is, I think, one of the biggest headaches for arms controllers at the moment. There are countries that have banned 3D printing of weapons or 3D making of weapons, whatever terminology is suitable. But again, the fact is that by banning something, that does not mean that it is not happening. When an incident takes place, only then we realize that this has happened. The case in point, the Abbey killing by this young man happened in a country which has one of the most vigilant and strict gun laws, and yet it took place, right? So you can't really stop if you want to call it an isolated incident, or you cannot stop people from making a bomb in the basement. I mean, although this is a term which was the title of a book about the nuclear weapons, but the fact is that this unfortunately is happening. And any amount of legislation and all, those who are doing these things will always keep a step ahead. So the governments have to really think about it. The non-proliferationists, the arms controllers, they really have to think ahead of those who are violating the treaties and the norms as to what is happening. And the emerging technologies is going to make this aspect all the more challenging. So any of the traditional protocols that we have, the POA, the ATT, there's so many other things that there are, they have to be synced with domestic legislations, or those who have signed on to them. They have to collaborate these two aspects. And the second thing is that we really need to think as to what kind of new stuff is going to be in the market. So that is one aspect.
Thank you, ma'am. There's a
Samran.
question by Samran. He says that there are two sides to illicit arms transfer, the demand and supply. Demand side has own political goals and the supply has commercial and financial interest. Which side contributes the most to illicit arms transfer, and which is easier to work on to curb the illicit arms transfer?
Demand will never finish unless there's an ideal world peace. So there would always be pockets of friction. There would always be zones of conflict. So the demand will keep coming up. But then you can also generate demand. If you don't have a market, you can always create a market. You can always create enabling grounds. I mean, who knew? People knew that something was brewing up in Ukraine, but you never know when there's going to be a new conflict zone erupting or something new is happening. And the way the world is heading, the deprivation conflict, climate change, these issues that we actually consider not to be traditional are also going to contribute to the traditional security threats. And they're going to, in the longer run, also become violent conflicts. They're going to be precursors of violent conflict. So the demand will always, unfortunately, remain there. And as I also said, that you can manufacture the demand. Supply part is always easier to handle, because whosoever is supplying, whether it is in the licit market or illicit market, depending on the strength of the governors, in the licit market, the countries themselves, international protocols, depending on how much invested you are in this system, you can do several measures to go about doing what you're doing. But again, I'm sorry, I'm referring time and again to the Afghan jihad time rather than to the current situation. But we can find several examples from that time. It's easier to and more comfortable to quote that time frame. If we had people in the civil military bureaucracy at that time who were the armament sultans, who were controlling these markets, and they were in uniform and they were regulators of weapons going in and out of Afghanistan, but they had a side business. So these things become extremely problematic. And that is where you have a weak social contract. So if you strengthen the social contract, a point that Adila had also brought up about governance. So despite the fact that there is no ideal governance mechanism, what will make a good country or a strong country is that you have laws, sufficient laws, not over-regulated, not over-legislated, but you implement them. You just don't make them there because they're required. You also follow them up. So the supply part is, I would actually say, is far easier to handle than the demand.
Thank you so much, Dr. Salma. Just an administrative announcement. Once the discussion ends, it's not ending right now, but once it ends, the team of Stratfor Asia has requested all of you to stay back for an administrative announcement. So please do not leave after the session has ended. Imran Abbasab, you have a question?
Yes, I wish to take it on the other side now, how to deal with the challenge, and especially with respect to Pakistan. Dr. Salma, do you think that media glorifying the use of weapons through movie posters, gaming, and that impact on the kids and the psychology aspect of having the weapon and then feeling yourself like a heroic icon, and that you are bringing up the kids up to the level when they are very used to it, using on the media or even through the gaming and then using it live. That's the one part that could be complicating, even if there is no specific culture in certain areas of Pakistan where gun has been the part of the culture. So even you can say the urban settings of say Punjab, Islamabad, and those which are more metropolitan cities, even there is a chance that the crime, terror, plus that social aspect consortium will be impacting our newer generations. And the second aspect is the military response. As we have seen that what has happened in Balochistan as of recently, the terrorists were using better equipment, even that of the laser guns against the FCs and the Hasadar force, whatever there are in Balochistan and KP areas. So don't you think that our since it has been long debated that our security threats are internal, by the way, but we see that in military terms we have hardened defenses on the eastern borders, whereas our law enforcing agencies on the western borders are less equipped. So what could be the way forward? Do we need to change the tactics, the training system, and be able to prepare our troops better to responding to the challenge? Thank you.
Right. Thank you so
Dr.
much.
Salma, if I may just add to this, can you talk about it in a larger context of how can Pakistan change the cultural and social romanticization with armament? As you said that the genie is out of the bottle, and you talked about that there's a concentrated need of government will to do that. But what about the software aspect of it, which is there right from the youngest generation up till the later parts of their lives?
Thank you so much. Although I did touch upon this, but because there was so much to it, I so agree with you. And I love this term where you call the social software, how we change this, and the media glorification. Okay, just look at this scenario. Many of you are this generation, which is the participant to this online workshop. Majority of you have not been oriented to the Sultan Rahis and Mustafa Qureshis of our time, or what was that? The Mola Jet generation that we had. Okay, so here is this thing. You have one man army where this guy gets the best good-looking Punjabi or Pakhtun lady who is singing and dancing like crazy in a very restrictive environment. And she's wearing so much of jewelry that if she was to be figured out, she would have actually bailed us out of all the debt that we have. And he's also holding this gun in his hand with a very fierce expression, a very dead expression. And the woman is just going crazy, dancing around him. Wow. I mean, we would find it funny. We are the urbanites. We really find it funny. We laugh like crazy. But think of a situation, you're in a small city, you're in a village, you get a chance to go and watch cinema, and there you have all this color, glitz, glamour, along with a gun. And suddenly the villain comes into the picture, and the heroine, who's all crazy dancing around, is picked up, taken away, screaming. And then the guy comes back, has 101 bullets on his chest, and still he ends up killing the entire city or the entire country and survives to sing another song with a female. That's extreme romanticization, right? That is like, wow, you can really do it. You're the Robin Hood. You're the Tom Cruise of this picture. You're the Maverick, right? So for these rural mavericks, it was such a fascinating picture. Plus the fact that majority of the people who are not socially, politically, economically, in any capacity empowered, when they were given the gun and they ended up killing you and me, who were sitting in these big houses with air conditioners and laptops and all that, and we died, that empowered them, right? That is the army of the militants, that is the army of the terrorist. Although much of terrorism that we look at, we are not looking at it from the social deprivation prism, but we do talk about that these people come from the underprivileged. But then we have also had young people coming from very privileged background and indulging in violent terrorism. So the picture is mixed. But yes, there's a lot of media glorification. There's a need to reboot the social software. There were times, there were discussions, shall we actually remove all toy guns from the market? Shall we remove everything that reminds children of guns? And then people said, are you really real? Can you really do that? What do you want? That your sons should play with Barbies? Right? So all of this social debate comes in. But you will never be able to remove guns. Guns cannot be removed. Complete disarmament can never happen. If you remove the guns, at the worst, one of the worst genocides that Africa faced in 1994 was the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the Hutus and the Tutsis turned against one another. And the Hutus did not kill people so much with the weapons than they did with machetes and knives. So remove the gun, give them another tool of conflict, and they'll kill. So it's a lot to do with your social environment. So yes, a certain bit of social software rebooting is required. We need to teach people. I mean, we are facing the burden and brunt of a generation which in its basic qaida, primer, read Alif, Allah, Jim, Jihad, Be, bomb, Teek, Te, Topak, Banduk, right? So if this is what they read as a 4-year-old, 5-year-old, then what do you actually think happened to them, right? It's where it is that social images of Mola Jats and the American equivalents of Sylvester Stallone's and so many other people. Okay, remove all the violent movies from Pakistan. The West has a lot of violence to show to you. And how many filters can you put in today's media, computers, laptops, mobiles? You can't bar people from seeing violent images and getting incited by the guns. So they are going to remain part of your social environment. Unfortunately, we cannot rid ourselves of that. But yes, we can make our own society, the one that we can manage ourselves a little better. And there's a need to do that, right? We don't need to have heroes standing with a dead expression and an AK-47 in their hand and taking the entire world and becoming the vigilante. We should not appreciate when people take justice in their hand and they burn robbers, right? We should not feel happy when suddenly religious vigilantes take it upon themselves to kill a person because he or she did not belong or adhere to their way of thinking. We are doing it. I'm guilty of that. We all are guilty of that. Unless and until we realize that these things are not to be done by us, this will continue happening. So that is unfortunate. And I couldn't agree more with both of you that there's a dire need to end this glorification. Ifra, your comment about, and I hope I have addressed these questions. The law enforcement agencies on the eastern border. Imran, yes, I talked about it, and I did mention that the police is far less endowed when it comes to facing the terrorist or in counterterrorism efforts than otherwise. And that is why there's a very huge number of law enforcement agents both in uniform and civilian, who have died as a result of what has happened. And this counterterrorism effort needs to cater to the fact that where the military is getting the right type of equipment, the military is getting the right type of training for counterterrorism, so does the police. But one a flip side to this a lot of times is that if the police becomes so, and of course it can also be that there is a counter militancy or counter-terrorist police squad, and not the usual police. But the fact is that unfortunately terrorism and gun violence is not restricted to selective spots, and it's all over, also makes it a bit more difficult for them to handle. But yes, there are no true opinions that they also need to be catered to. But several people who do not advocate too much of weaponization or overtraining of the police in counter-terrorist efforts is because, unfortunately, the police or the law enforcement agencies in Pakistan are the successors of the British legacy. And the British had made the police department more as a deterrent force, anti-civilian force, rather than a pro-civilian or a civilian-friendly space. And more they are empowered, more they're equipped, more lethal and anti people they would be. So this is also a counter opinion about that, but definitely they need to be. And when it comes to the eastern border, it's the paramilitary which is looking after that, and those who are in these thick of the areas need to be properly equipped.
Thank you, ma'am. Would you want to take Ifra's question, or do you think you've sufficiently addressed it?
Ifra's question about current scenario in Afghanistan, trade of illicit weapons, absolutely, Ifra. It's going to become far more challenging and very difficult. One visible measure could be fencing of the border, the entire border, which the Taliban are resisting. There is very little area left which needs to be fenced, but Pakistan really has to do it. But having said that, very interestingly, if any one of you have seen this Indian movie where Salman Khan rescued this young child to Pakistan across the border, and they moved through these tunnels, actually, Pak-Afghan border is littered with tunnels, right? And it's littered with illicit areas through which they can move. And all of these things. Plus, we should also not neglect another aspect that we are not talking about. Is the law enforcement agencies or the agents, many a times themselves are enablers, willingly and unwillingly, right? Because of the economic factors, because of the fear factor. So they do allow illicit actors entry or free passage back and forth for fear of their life and also for money. And that makes the picture very complicated. So fencing is definitely there, better oversights, more mechanical measures such as having cameras and various other things through which they can be monitored. A little less human involvement and more non-human involvement can also attribute to control of the borders and securing of the borders. Right. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Fazal Ilahi Bilal first. Then Imran Abbas had asked another question, and then finally Adila Ahmed, and then we'll see if we'll have more time. We can take in more questions. Other than that, let's give the floor to Fazal Saab. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you, sir. I'm Fazal Bilal, a PhD scholar from University of Lahore. First of all, thanks, Dr. Salma, to give a comprehensive analysis on the subject. My primary question is I want to discuss the human psychology and nature, because you know it's a human instinct that everyone, every nation, individual or nation, want to score more and more, either illicit market or illicit market. So this is a human nature, and this factor can explain through a case of Turkey, as in a last conference in May, I think your good self was also there as a keynote speaker. Lots of strategic and security expert of Turkey was continuously asking a question that Pakistan assists Turkey in a acquiring nuclear weapon. So this the insecure factor is always there. Secondly, I want to discuss another element of armed trade treaty. America, despite of signing in 2013, yet not been rectified, despite of twice turned down by the Senate. What your good self seeing the fate of this treaty, because it was absolute failure at present, and resultantly global arms trading is still on rise and continues to fuel human rights abuses. So I would like to request your good self to enlighten all of us about the fate of this treaty. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fazal Saab. Adila?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Okay, my question is particularly as you talk about social reforms to counter the challenges. So basically, my question is, ma'am, when we talk about social reforms and the role of police, as you mentioned, I just want to have a query that Pakistan is experiencing a consistency of national level demonstration targeting various political, social, and religious agenda. And in that, to portray that agenda, usually used as non-violent, doing violent protests, right? So in that context, I think there is need for reconciliation approach that is much needed, I think, to counter such challenges. And I also want to mention that as you also said, that implementation of a security management, state police are in charge of anticipating the security situation in order to ensure peace and law and order. So to deal with such situation, I think it is necessary to understand why some group of people behave violently. As we also observe, there are group of people who are doing protest non-violently. So I think there is need to demark, have a fine line between two, and to counter those who are acting violently and what are the reasons, and then they can be, then reconciliation can be happen. Ma'am, your take on it. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Adila. And Imran Saab? Okay. Adila, one mistake we usually make when we are looking at different actors or dissenting voices is that we tend to think that all of the people who are saying something which is not conforming to the popular viewpoint or the established viewpoint are anti-state. They're not. They may not be. Perhaps what they're saying is a few points, they are very angry, but yet they're non-violent. But what they're trying to tell you is that there is something that needs to be addressed. But then you would also come across people, as you've just said, that there are a group of people who would always remain angry and become violent, which is so different from those who are non-violent. Why are they violent? So we use a common yardstick. We actually tend to address both the categories with the same tendency. And that ends up giving rise to a group of perfectly nice, good people who never wanted to be violent, turning into very, very angry, violent people. I'm not saying that they are not good, but they are angry people. They want to rebel and retaliate, just like a small child who doesn't get his toffee and he starts screaming and banging his feet on the ground. And again, we don't open any window for discussion and we treat them violently. Many a times we don't actually address those miscreants who are creating violence in the name of a political or religious ideology and say that, no, they are nice people, we should give them another chance. And then we end up actually doing more damage. So the picture is very complicated. Whom to address, how to address, at what intervals. But the good point always would be to take all of these case studies apart, not group them as a single aspect and treat them with the same stick. All of them require a different treatment to be treated. And unless and until we use a different mechanisms with all of them, we are going to mess up. Perhaps a non-violent actor may end up becoming more dangerous to the state's survivability than a violent actor is. But try and understand why is the actor violent here? Have we messed up in the past? Have we done some major damage to the subculture of that society that they are retaliating with guns? What did we do wrong? We are usually not introspective. We are usually only addressing the cosmetic issues. So we need to go beyond the cosmetics. We need to go beyond the surface of the problem. So usually the violent expression is the tip of the iceberg. The iceberg is much deeper and much stronger. So one has to look at the root cause of the problem to understand and address it in an appropriate fashion. The biggest mistake conflict resolution experts make is that they tend to, and states usually don't have that much of time at their hand. So what they do is that they use the same yardstick to apply on everyone. As a teacher, one would see that there are certain students who are more adept at understanding things in comparison to others, so they may need more attention. So the approach would be that way. The angry youth will remain angry unless and until we provide them with sufficient opportunities to sort of come down from their angry scale. Many a times we would have children coming from differently least privileged areas, and when they come here, for them this is like a total contrast from their own country, from their own city, and we think that, oh, they're just sharing the space with us, so we are the same people. No, they haven't seen many of the privileges, and they will never, their city skin will never see the privileges that they're being exposed to when they come to the cities. So instead of investing a lot on education, which is not going to provide them with good vocation, with good jobs, I think we should now focus on education which is vocational based, which adds to their skills, which enables them to contribute to the society. I mean, having 100 plus political scientists with no seat to apply for and to teach, you have, or at least one seat, you have 99 angry young men, some of them married with no job. So we really need to, as a state, watch what the indicators of the state are, what is required. We have CPEC happening. Why are we producing people who have degrees that have zero applicability when it comes to CPEC? Why aren't we improvising our educational system and going for skill development so that they can benefit from the wave of the future? I mean, do you think Salma Malik with a DSS background has any business on Gwadar port except to take selfies? None, right? So have the appropriate type of stuff. Fazal, your question about the power quest, that is so right. Everyone is invested in that, and we are doing it. US ratification of ATT will never come about. Most of the countries, they end up signing a treaty because that looks good, but ratification becomes a much more problematic area. Once they ratify, that is going to benefit countries such are different reasons for not going in that direction. And one must point out here is that countries such as, protocols such as the ATT and all, they're very political in nature, and they are discriminatory protocols. So that is a problem.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Imran Abbas, would you please ask a short question that ma'am can answer within a couple of minutes, so that because we're running out of time. unfortunately.
I beg your pardon, Ali, again, my apologies for
Sure,
interjecting.
no, it's okay.
Of course, here's the moderator. I just wanted to point out, we do have another question because I believe Imran has also had the opportunity to ask questions. I think we've got one in the chat window from a BS student, if ma'am would like to consider it. From
Have
Alina
I
Afzal.
missed it?
I think it's a little further
Isa, can
up.
you kindly point out the name or the question?
Alina, it's Alina Afzal. She's asking
Oh,
to what
Alina,
extent.
I missed that.
I missed that as well. It's not.
It
Alina,
says-
can you unmute?
I can just read out the question quickly. To
Sure,
what
please
extent
go
does the nature and history of Asian culture impact gun violence? So that's the question. And Ali, back to you. Thanks.
Sure, thank you, ma'am. Would you please take this? Thank you.
What is the extent of? Sorry, can you please come again?
Aiza, would you?
To what extent does the nature and history of Asian culture impact gun violence?
Asian culture.
Yes.
I very honestly, Alina, have not come across a study which is particular to the Asian culture as such. Are you talking about South Asian culture or are you looking at the entire Asian culture? South Asian culture, I would say, depending on what the history of South Asia was, the British brought about the Darra markets and other markets. There's also a parallel market in Bangladesh and some other places, which made this appeal for illicit or gray market areas in this space a lot more than otherwise. Had that not been there, I mean, these were people who were working in Oman and some other places whom the British brought here and gave them space to run these industries, not for any altruistic perspective, but to counter the gate grain, right? Because the British thought that if they fortify Afghanistan or Afghania at that time and Afghania as the buffer zone, and then the forward defense policy of the British, in which the FATA was highly instrumental, that was the buffer of the buffer. So when the Soviets, when the Russians or the Germans come, the Afghans or the Pakhtuns are going to become the first line of defense for them, right? And that is the purpose as to why the gun was also romanticized a lot. And that is where the initial question about the demand and the supply also came up, because they created a culture, they created an environment. By having said that, not saying that the Afridis and the Mahsoods did not have guns, they always had guns. But one way of the British winning over these people, and I'm talking about pre-partition time in the 1800s and 1900s, was that when they, piece by piece, ended up conquering these agencies and the tribal areas as well as the border zones, everywhere they would sign an agreement with the Malik. You maintain your pagri, you will get a purse, and you also maintain your guns. And for every gun, the advertisement that I was alluding to earlier, that was to join the First World War. But it was also an appeal that you bring your gun with you, which is, wow, I can take my Kalash with me, the Kalashnikov with me, right? So these were incentives that made these people fiercely protective of their weaponry, that the Goras could not make me get rid of my weapon. How can these people do what they're doing, right? So those factors also contributed to the creation of a gun culture, which we willingly and unwillingly, I mean, I wouldn't say unwillingly, but intentionally or unintentionally, progressed further. Because then in the 1970s and 80s, Afghanistan became turbulent, so we needed the guns. So we once again encouraged those people, and around that time, those of us who were there actually witnessed where the Hollywood movies would have reference to the Darra and the heroes would be actually roaming around the Dara, getting those weapons. The James Bonds of those time would have pen guns, which the M would ask, where did you get that from? And James Bond would say, Pakistan, Peshawar, and all of that. And wow, that was such a kick that you got out of it. So these things were there, unfortunately, which have contributed. Last, I think, sorry, Imran, मैं आपका question भी देखती हूँ. Jamal, you have asked a question about illicit narrative are major. Do you think people with illicit narrative are major proliferator like we witnessed in Sawat? How illicit weapons are being proliferated from Kashmir? Please elaborate. Proliferated from Kashmir into Pakistan or being sent to Kashmir? Jamal?
At the outset, ma'am, you talked about sources of proliferation from Afghanistan as well as from Kashmir. So please elaborate how Kashmiris are proliferating these illicit weapons from or to the Kashmir.
I won't really say Kashmiris, but those who are controlling the weapons, right? You have a conflict zone. Conflict can only run when there are guns available, right? So they need the guns because they are facing a huge military, the Indian military. So yes, you need to send the guns across. So there are many areas through which that can happen. And yes, the power of narrative is very strong, whether it is licit narrative or illicit narrative. And usually such stakeholders who are countering the state, if you ever get the chance to read the classic guerrilla literature, especially Mao Zedong. So Mao Zedong's literature, when he was looking at the revolution and kicking off the revolution, we would actually laugh like crazy when we read the 10 tenets of Mao Zedong's revolutionary manual, in which one was that thou shalt fill the bucket of your neighbor, thou shalt keep your blanket wrapped up and cleaned, the room in proper order. So we would find it very funny, but actually the depth of that thing was that create such a positive image of yourself in your neighborhood that people are impressed and they join the revolutionary fervor. And as part of that, the biggest thing, Mao Zedong, Lawrence Lawrence and all, especially when it came to the guerrilla literature or revolutionary literature, was the power of psychology, the propaganda you are inflicting on the people. And that is not only through the power of words, that is also the power of action. So the more impressive is your narrative, the more the catchment would be. And Imran, to your question about Pakistan offering alternate economic opportunity or civic engagement, given the constraints for the one who want a fresh start from previous sub-conventional military projects, any rehab initiated? Yes, there are several rehabilitative activities which have been initiated. Most of them are being spearheaded or being led by the military, even if the civilians are doing it, but the military is keeping an overall kind of supervision over it. But counterterrorism efforts such as those undertaken by Saudi Arabia, where they actually treat the terrorists or yesteryear terrorists like Prince, and they make them sit in big palaces and watch movies and all that stuff, that Pakistan cannot afford. We don't have that type of money. But there are several success stories.
Thank you so much, Dr. Salma, for such an enlightening and enriching talk. I'm sure that there are so many more questions that time unfortunately doesn't allow us. Thank you so much. If we can have a virtual round of applause by using your reactions to thumbs up or to clapping, would love to have that. Thank you so much, ma'am. It's a treat always. And I hope that you keep on enriching us, mentoring all of us, the multiple generations of mentorship that you have provided. You are truly a valuable asset to the strategic community. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm so truly honored, totally humbled. God bless you all. Thank you
You
for the
as well.
opportunity.
Again, for the administrative announcement, guys, if you may all stay behind, the team at Stratfor Asia has a few administrative announcements. With that, I'll also be signing off. Thank you so much for all your questions and the participations. I hope to see you guys tomorrow for another really good session that will be undertaken by Ambassador Zamir Akram. Thank you so much, guys. Take care and have a nice day. Allah Hafiz.
Thank you so much, Ali. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow. All right, so thank you everybody for sticking around. So I just have 3 quick announcements, important ones, and then Faraz will make an announcement as well. So first of all, quite a few of you have already sent me your requests for the certificates, so we've received them, and we'll be sharing the payment account details by the end of this week or at the latest by Monday. So you will get that, and all of your requests have been noted and you've been acknowledged on email as well. The second announcement, which is quite important, is that at the beginning of this workshop, when we were conceiving it, we decided that we wanted to have an exercise where you could sort of accumulate or take everything